They didn't meet him in a mansion. They didn't meet him with bodyguards. They didn't meet him with gold watches or gunmen. They met Paul Le Roux the way governments often do, quietly, clinically, across a table. To the people watching him at the time, he didn't look like a threat. He looked like paperwork. By the late 2000s, law enforcement agencies across multiple continents were chasing something they couldn't quite name yet. Not a cartel, not a gang, not an army, a system. Weapons were moving without fingerprints. Drugs were crossing borders without violence. Money was clearing without noise. Routes were working too well. And every time an investigation followed the trail, it didn't end with a kingpin. It ended with infrastructure. At the center of that infrastructure sat a man most criminals never respected at first glance, Paul Le Roux. Born in Zimbabwe, raised in South Africa, educated in code, not crime, Le Roux didn't come up through the underworld. He didn't inherit a territory. He didn't fight for corners. He didn't build loyalty through fear. He built efficiency. To people who knew him early, Paul Le Roux was a programmer, a systems thinker, a man who believed complexity could be solved if you understood how pieces fit together. That belief would later terrify governments. Around the same time, across different parts of the world, other men were building power the old way. Men like Victor Bout, whose aircraft moved weapons across war zones using scale and deniability. Men like Mansour al-Qasr, whose reach depended on political access, favors, and noise. Men inside cartel structures, logistics chiefs, transport coordinators, fixers, connected to organizations like Sinaloa, whose power came from territory and intimidation. They all understood violence. What they didn't fully understand yet was abstraction. Paul Le Roux didn't compete with these men directly. He overlapped with them. Same oceans, same ports, same weak states, same corruptible systems, but his approach was different. Where Bout relied on aircraft and spectacle, Le Roux relied on routing. Where cartel bosses relied on fear, Le Roux relied on dependency. Where arms dealers relied on ideology or politics, Le Roux relied on plausible paperwork. He didn't sell himself as powerful, he sold himself as useful. And that's where the mistake happened, because in the criminal world, and inside government agencies too, useful people are assumed to be replaceable. Cartel intermediaries thought they could pressure him. They were wrong. They assumed logistics were interchangeable. They were wrong. They assumed routes could be replicated if they leaned hard enough. They were wrong. What they didn't see was that Paul Le Roux wasn't just moving product. He was mapping how power flowed. At the same time, U.S. federal agencies, particularly the DEA, were watching something unusual emerge. Not just drug movement, not just weapons, but coordination between networks that normally didn't trust each other. Mercenaries tied to former U.S. Special Forces, shipping paths crossing West Africa, synthetic drug production feeding multiple markets without turf wars. And quietly, repeatedly, the same name surfaced in reports. Not as a boss, not as a commander, as a connector. Paul Le Roux didn't command loyalty, he engineered reliance. If you removed him suddenly, routes didn't just slow down, they failed. And that's when everyone, criminals and governments alike, realized something uncomfortable. You could threaten a cartel boss, you could assassinate an arms dealer, but what do you do with a man whose power exists mostly on paper, in timing, and in systems no one else fully understands? This wasn't a criminal who ruled through fear. This was a man who designed himself to be too valuable to remove quickly. And when law enforcement finally moved closer, they didn't find a monster. They found a man who had already planned for the moment he would sit across from them, calm, prepared, and holding something far more dangerous than a weapon, information, and that's where the story truly begins. The first people to misjudge Paul Le Roux weren't law enforcement, it was the criminals. Inside cartel ecosystems, there's a hierarchy everyone understands. At the top, the boss. Below him, lieutenants. Below them, logistics men. Logistics people are useful, but replaceable. At least, that's what they believed. By the mid to late 2000s, cartel networks tied to Sinaloa were expanding aggressively beyond the Americas. Cocaine routes through West Africa, synthetic drug precursors moving through Asia, weapons and security contractors appearing where they normally wouldn't. These weren't random overlaps, they were intersections. And at several of those intersections sat Paul Le Roux, not as a cartel member, not as an ally, as a service layer. Le Roux didn't negotiate like cartel bosses expected. He didn't posture, he didn't threaten, he didn't inflate his importance. He spoke in terms of timelines, redundancy, and failure rates. That alone unsettled people. Cartel intermediaries, men who answered to figures like Vicente Zambada Niebla, son of Ismael El Mayo Zambada, began to test him. Small pressure at first, delayed payments, unreasonable demands, suggestions that other people could do what he did. This was standard cartel behavior: break the confidence, assert dominance, force compliance. Paul Le Roux didn't argue, he didn't escalate, he adjusted. Routes that once cleared smoothly began encountering minor issues: shipping containers flagged for inspection, local facilitators suddenly unavailable. Paperwork errors that didn't look criminal, just inconvenient. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, just enough friction to cause delays. At first, cartel managers assumed coincidence. Ports are unpredictable. Governments are inefficient. Things happen. But the delays clustered. Not everywhere, only on routes where pressure had been applied. This was the moment most criminals would panic. Paul Le Roux didn't, because he wasn't reacting. He was demonstrating dependency. Behind the scenes, Le Roux' system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. He had built redundancy across continents, multiple shipping agents who didn't know each other, paper trails that could be rerouted without explanation, contractors who didn't ask why, only how much and when. Cartels controlled territory, Le Roux controlled movement through territory, and movement was everything. One cartel fixer reportedly described the situation later in blunt terms. It wasn't that he stopped helping us, it was that we realized we didn't know how things worked without him. That realization spread quietly, because admitting it openly would have been dangerous. At the same time, Le Roux was watching another group very closely. Men like Victor Bout had shown the cost of visibility. Bout moved massive volumes, but scale attracts attention. Le Roux preferred precision. He moved smaller loads more intelligently, with fewer signatures. Where Bout dominated airspace, Le Roux mastered paperwork. And paperwork, it turned out, was harder to bomb. Cartel leadership began to reassess. This wasn't a nerd they could scare. This was a node they couldn't remove without collapsing parts of their own operation. Threatening him would hurt them. Replacing him would expose them. Killing him would raise questions no one wanted asked. So the pressure stopped. Not because Paul Le Roux demanded it, but because the cost-benefit calculation flipped. And that's the part that terrified law enforcement later, because the cartels hadn't lost control to Le Roux. They had yielded efficiency to him, which meant when the DEA eventually moved in, they weren't dealing with a kingpin surrounded by muscle. They were dealing with a man whose absence could destabilize networks across oceans. And Paul Le Roux knew it. He had watched this same pattern play out with arms dealers, traffickers, and fixers before. The moment when powerful men realize too late that the quiet one isn't weak, he's structural. And while the cartels were backing off, another group was moving closer, carefully, patiently. The U.S. government. The DEA didn't find Paul Le Roux by chasing him. They found him by eliminating everyone else. By the time his name began appearing with any consistency, federal agents were already frustrated. Every investigation looked solid, right up until it wasn't. Drug cases collapsed because the logistics were too clean. Arms investigations stalled because the suppliers never touched the weapons. Money laundering trails ended in jurisdictions that didn't cooperate and didn't need to. What agents were seeing wasn't chaos, it was design. The first red flag wasn't violence, it was the absence of it. In environments where intimidation and bloodshed were normal, Le Roux's roots stayed quiet. No turf wars, no assassinations, no dramatic power grabs, just flow. That made analysts uncomfortable, because criminals who avoid violence usually aren't weak, they're careful. Inside DEA task forces, Paul Le Roux was initially categorized incorrectly, not as a target, as a facilitator, a man who connected people. That classification delayed everything. Facilitators are useful, but they're not seen as architects until someone inside the system starts asking the wrong question. That question was simple. Why does removing him break things that shouldn't break? Financial analysts noticed something unusual. When certain shipments failed, it wasn't random. The failures followed logic. Routes rerouted before inspections, payments staggered just below reporting thresholds, shell companies dissolved and reappeared with new names but identical operational behavior. Someone wasn't improvising. Someone was forecasting. At the same time, intelligence began surfacing from an unexpected angle. Mercenaries, men tied to Joseph Hunter, a former U.S. Army Special Forces soldier, began appearing in places they shouldn't have been. Africa, the Philippines, remote maritime regions, these weren't cartel gunmen. They were professionals. And they weren't loyal to cartels. They were loyal to contracts. That connection changed how investigators viewed Le Roux. Because cartel bosses don't hire ex-U.S. Special Forces. They intimidate. They recruit locally. They rely on fear. Le Roux outsourced fear, which meant he didn't need loyalty, he needed performance. This is where the DEA began to understand what they were actually dealing with. Paul Le Roux wasn't building an empire, he was building a portfolio. Drugs were one asset, arms were another, security services were a third. Shipping and finance tied it all together. Each component could function independently. But together, they formed a system resilient enough to survive disruption. That resilience is what drew attention from higher levels. Not just DEA field agents, but analysts, strategists, people who studied criminal networks the way engineers study failure points. And when they mapped Le Roux's operation, something unsettling appeared. He didn't sit at the top. He sat outside the hierarchy, which meant traditional takedown strategies wouldn't work. You couldn't flip underlings if they didn't know the full system. You couldn't seize territory if he didn't own any. You couldn't provoke violence to expose him, because violence wasn't his tool. So the DEA changed tactics. They stopped trying to corner him. They started trying to understand him, how he thought, how he planned, how he prepared for collapse. That's when they realized something critical. Paul Le Roux wasn't reacting to law enforcement pressure. He was expecting it. Every move suggested someone who had already run the scenario. Arrest, extradition, negotiation. He had modeled it. And for the first time, a dangerous thought surfaced inside federal briefings. What if arresting him isn't the end of the operation, but part of it? Because men who rule through fear collapse when captured. Men who rule through systems adapt. And Paul Le Roux was a systems man. By the time the DEA moved closer, quietly positioning assets, Paul Le Roux had already reached a conclusion most criminals never do. That power doesn't come from avoiding capture. It comes from controlling what happens after it. Stings are built on one assumption, that the target doesn't see them coming. By 2011, the DEA wasn't chasing Paul Le Roux anymore. They were inviting him, quietly, indirectly. Through the same channels criminals trust more than anything else: introductions. An undercover operation began forming around something Le Roux understood well: arms and security. The bait wasn't drugs. It wasn't money. It wasn't ego. It was logistics. Specifically, weapons procurement tied to potential violence in Southeast Asia. This wasn't random. Agents knew Le Roux's history. They knew he worked through contractors. They knew he preferred precision over noise. They knew he avoided ideology. So they presented him with a problem that looked purely transactional. No speeches, no threats, no emotion, just a deal. On paper, it made sense. A buyer with money, a need for weapons, a region Le Roux already understood. To most criminals, this would have looked like opportunity. To Paul Le Roux, it looked like confirmation. Because here's the part most people miss. By the time the DEA reached out, Paul Le Roux had already accepted that his exposure was increasing. Too many intersections, too many continents, too many moving parts. He didn't panic. He evaluated. The question wasn't if law enforcement would eventually catch up. It was how much leverage he would have when they did. And leverage doesn't come from running. It comes from being useful at the exact moment you're cornered. Le Roux didn't rush into the deal. He asked questions, detailed ones, about delivery methods, about end users, about timelines, the kind of questions that made undercover agents uncomfortable, because they revealed something unsettling. He wasn't improvising. He was auditing. Every answer they gave him told him something about jurisdiction, about authority, about how far the operation really went. And slowly, quietly, Paul Le Roux did what he always did best. He mapped the system he was dealing with. The final meeting was set in Liberia, a country he knew well, a place with weak oversight and strong incentives. To the DEA, it was neutral ground. To Le Roux, it was familiar terrain. When he arrived, he wasn't armed. He wasn't nervous. He didn't behave like a man about to be arrested. He behaved like a man checking off steps. The moment agents moved in, there was no resistance, no chase, no outburst, no panic, just a pause, and then something unexpected. Paul Le Roux spoke, calmly, directly, as if this was a meeting he had been expecting. People later familiar with the case would describe his demeanor as unsettling, not defiant, not broken, prepared. Because this wasn't the end of his planning, it was the transition to the next phase. While agents believed they had finally closed the net, Paul Le Roux was already shifting his position, from operator to asset. He understood something most criminals never do until it's too late, that governments don't just arrest people like him, they evaluate them. And Paul Le Roux had spent years making himself invaluable. As he was taken into custody, the question inside federal circles wasn't, how long will he go away for? It was something far more dangerous. What exactly does this man know? Because the moment Paul Le Roux stopped being free, he became the most comprehensive map of global criminal logistics the U.S. government had ever encountered, and he knew it. Interrogation rooms are designed to break people. Small spaces, neutral colors, silence stretched thin. They're meant for men who panic when control's taken away. Paul Le Roux didn't panic, because by the time he sat down, he had already reframed the situation. This wasn't an interrogation, it was a negotiation. Most defendants offer information the way desperate people do: names, locations, confessions. Paul Le Roux didn't start there. He started with structure. He didn't ask for a deal immediately. He asked questions. What jurisdictions were involved? Which agencies were present? Who had decision-making authority? Not out of arrogance, out of calibration. He needed to know who could actually say yes. When he finally spoke substantively, it wasn't dramatic. There was no single bombshell. There was something far more dangerous. Context. He explained how networks really worked, not the headlines, not the bosses, the plumbing. How arms dealers overlapped with drug routes, how mercenary contractors moved quietly between conflicts, how ports in West Africa acted as switches, not destinations, how money didn't move. It rested, briefly, before being reassigned. He didn't just describe crimes. He explained why previous investigations kept failing. Agents listening began to realize something unsettling. They weren't hearing stories. They were being handed a manual to an invisible system. Names came later, figures connected to arms pipelines once associated with people like Victor Bout, facilitators who overlapped with Middle Eastern and African brokers in the orbit of Mansour al-Qassar. Cartel logistics intermediaries tied to Sinaloa, men who never appeared in indictments because they never touched product. Le Roux didn't frame them as villains, he framed them as nodes, replaceable only if you understood what they did. This is where the power shifted. Because most cooperators trade information for leniency. Paul Le Roux traded understanding for leverage. He wasn't just helping close cases, he was helping agencies rethink how global crime actually functioned. At one point, someone reportedly asked him why he was cooperating so fully. Why not hold something back? Paul Le Roux's answer was simple. Because partial truth creates chaos. And chaos attracts attention. He wasn't trying to burn the world down. He was trying to exit it cleanly. That meant making himself indispensable long enough to negotiate terms. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began to realize the scale of what they were dealing with. This wasn't one case. It was a cascade. Each disclosure unlocked another network. Each network revealed another overlap. Each overlap explained years of unanswered questions. And quietly, the conversation inside government circles changed, from punishment to containment. Paul Le Roux had done something no cartel boss, arms dealer, or trafficker ever managed. He turned his arrest into strategic value, and the more he explained, the clearer it became. Removing him violently would have collapsed systems without understanding them, but absorbing his knowledge, That would allow governments to reshape the board. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man who had avoided violence his entire career was now causing the largest disruptions through cooperation. But this level of cooperation comes with a price, not just for him, for everyone connected to him, because once information starts moving, so do consequences. When Paul Le Roux started talking, nothing exploded. There were no mass arrests overnight, no dramatic raids caught on camera, no public announcements tying everything together. That's what made the fallout so disturbing. It happened silently. Across different parts of the world, operations that had run smoothly for years began to malfunction. Not violently, not obviously. They just stopped working. In West Africa, shipping routes that once cleared without friction suddenly stalled. Containers sat longer than usual. Paperwork faced unexpected scrutiny. Trusted facilitators went quiet. No one knew why, because no one had been arrested yet. In Southeast Asia, precursor chemicals that normally moved with ease began encountering regulatory complications. Not bans, not seizures, delays, the kind that disrupt production schedules without drawing attention. And inside cartel structures, something unsettling happened. People began blaming each other. Logistics chiefs accused transport coordinators of incompetence, fixers accused financiers of cutting corners, lieutenants accused each other of talking. Paranoia spread, not because violence had occurred, but because nothing made sense anymore. This is the part outsiders rarely understand. Criminal organizations don't collapse when leaders are removed. They collapse when trust in the system disappears. And Paul Le Roux, Paul, understood that better than anyone. Some intermediaries tried to adapt. They searched for replacements, other facilitators, new routes, different paperwork. But every replacement introduced risk. More people, more noise, more mistakes. The efficiency Le Roux had engineered was gone, and it couldn't be recreated quickly. In arms trafficking circles, the shock was even sharper. Networks that once relied on layered deniability suddenly found their insulation gone, not because names were exposed publicly, but because patterns were understood privately. Authorities didn't need to know who pulled the trigger. They knew how weapons moved. And once you understand movement, seizures become surgical. Men who had operated comfortably in the shadows began making mistakes, rushing deals, changing protocols too quickly, trusting the wrong intermediaries. Mistakes attract attention. Attention attracts investigations. Some figures disappeared entirely, not arrested, just gone. Operations abandoned. Routes shut down voluntarily. Better to stop than to be next. Inside cartel leadership, an uncomfortable truth emerged. Paul Le Roux hadn't betrayed them emotionally. He had outgrown them strategically. They had built empires dependent on continuity. He had built systems designed for disruption, including his own removal. And here's the most unsettling part. Le Roux's cooperation didn't just hurt criminals. It forced governments to confront something too, that their previous understanding of organized crime had been incomplete. They had been fighting people when they should have been fighting systems. Some cases linked back to Le Roux never went to trial, not because they were weak, but because revealing too much would expose methods governments preferred to keep quiet. So files were sealed, charges quietly dropped or reshaped, narratives simplified, and to the outside world, it looked like nothing had changed. Drugs still moved, weapons still existed, crime didn't disappear. But under the surface, the board had shifted. Routes became less efficient. Violence became less predictable. Costs went up. That's how you know disruption worked, because Paul Le Roux didn't destroy the criminal world. He made it worse at what it did best. And while that chaos unfolded, Paul Le Roux himself was moving into the most dangerous phase of his life. Not freedom, not prison, something far stranger. Deals like this are never written in one room. They're assembled slowly, across agencies, across jurisdictions, across priorities that don't always agree. And Paul Le Roux knew that. On paper, his case was simple. Drug trafficking, arms dealing, conspiracy. Enough charges to bury a man for life. But paper doesn't tell the whole story. Behind closed doors, prosecutors faced a problem they rarely admit publicly. Paul Le Roux didn't just know who committed crimes, he knew how entire criminal ecosystems functioned. And that kind of knowledge doesn't fit neatly into indictments, it fits into briefings. Some agencies wanted maximum punishment, others wanted maximum intelligence. Those goals don't always align, because locking someone away forever can mean locking their knowledge away too. Le Roux understood this tension instinctively. He didn't posture, he didn't threaten, he let silence do the work. When he spoke about cooperation, he didn't frame it as confession. He framed it as transfer. Transfer of understanding, transfer of patterns, transfer of lessons learned. He wasn't offering criminals, he was offering clarity. That clarity created unease, because the more he explained, the more it became obvious that some past failures weren't due to lack of effort. They were due to lack of comprehension. Agencies began comparing notes. Cases that once seemed unrelated suddenly aligned. Operations that had stalled years earlier suddenly made sense. Le Roux's information didn't just help future investigations. It reframed the past. And that's where things became uncomfortable. Because acknowledging the value of his cooperation meant admitting how much had been missed before. Governments don't like that. So the deal stayed quiet. Publicly, Paul Le Roux would be portrayed as a criminal who cooperated. Privately, he was treated as something else, a reference point, a living index of how modern transnational crime actually operated. That distinction mattered, because it shaped what kind of future he could have. Not freedom, but not disappearance into a cell either. Witness protection isn't just about safety, it's about control. Where you live, who you speak to, what you're allowed to know. For most cooperators, that's a downgrade. For Paul Le Roux, it was familiar territory, constraints, rules, systems. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The man who had once navigated weak states and corrupt ports was now being managed by one of the most structured systems on Earth. And just like before, Paul Le Roux adapted. He didn't try to escape. He didn't try to rebuild. He didn't try to reclaim power. Because he had already reached the only victory that mattered to him, survival with relevance. That's why so much of his case remains sealed, not to protect him, but to protect what his cooperation revealed. To this day, there are questions no one officially answers. How many operations were quietly altered because of what he said? How many routes were shut down without headlines? How many people realized too late that the game had changed? Those questions don't fit press releases. So they linger. And Paul Le Roux became something rare in the criminal world. Not a martyr, not a legend in exile, but a ghost embedded in the system he once exploited. When systems collapse, they don't crush everyone equally. They expose the people who were never meant to be visible. The first men to feel the consequences of Paul Le Roux's cooperation weren't the famous fouille names. They were the intermediaries, the fixers, the coordinators, the quiet specialists who made things move and never appeared in headlines. These were the men who believed invisibility was protection. In cartel-linked networks tied to Sinaloa, logistics figures who once operated with confidence suddenly found themselves isolated. Payments slowed, trust evaporated, meetings stopped happening in person. When your role is coordination, silence is lethal. Because it means no one wants to be seen with you anymore. Some tried to disappear on their own. They shut down routes voluntarily, moved families, abandoned operations overnight, not because they were under arrest, but because they understood something had shifted upstream. Someone was talking, and not emotionally, systematically. In arms trafficking circles, the reckoning was sharper. Figures operating in the orbit once associated with men like Mansour al-Qassar found their access shrinking, not through arrests, through exclusion. Ports that once accepted shipments stopped returning calls. Paperwork that once passed inspection now failed repeatedly. Financial channels that once wrested money temporarily no longer did. They hadn't been exposed publicly. They had been mapped privately. That distinction mattered. Because mapping doesn't require spectacle. It requires patience. Some contractors tied to Joseph Hunter's mercenary ecosystem made the same mistake cartel figures always make. They assumed violence could solve the problem. Threats were issued, warnings passed quietly. But there was no one left to threaten, Paul Le Roux wasn't reachable, and the system he had built no longer needed him to function in the same way. This is where fear turned inward. Men who once relied on hierarchy realized they had no protection, no boss to shield them, no structure to absorb pressure, just names sitting in sealed files. A few were arrested quietly, not as part of major cases, as unrelated charges, tax issues, immigration violations, regulatory offenses, the kind that don't attract attention but remove people permanently. Others simply vanished from the criminal landscape, not confirmed dead, not imprisoned publicly. They just stopped appearing in intelligence reports, which, in that world, is its own kind of ending. And this is the part that solidified Paul Le Roux's reputation among those who truly understood what happened. He didn't destroy his rivals directly. He made them expendable. Once systems were understood, individuals lost their leverage. Replaceable. Disposable. Exactly what cartel bosses once thought he was. That realization traveled quietly. Because admitting it openly would mean admitting vulnerability. So no one talked about Paul Le Roux anymore, not with anger, with caution. By the time his name stopped circulating in criminal channels, it wasn't because he had been forgotten. It was because everyone understood the risk of building anything dependent on one mind. Again. And that left one final question hanging. What happens to a man who dismantles systems without firing a shot, and then disappears into one controlled by the very governments he once outmaneuvered? Most men lose leverage the moment they stop talking. Paul Le Roux did the opposite. By the time his cooperation reached its deepest phase, the obvious value had already been extracted. Routes explained, networks mapped, patterns understood. On paper, his usefulness should have declined, but Paul Le Roux had planned for that too. Because information has layers, and he never gave all of it at once, not out of malice, out of control. Those close to the process later described something unusual. Le Roux never rushed to finish cooperating. He paced it, carefully. He understood that once everything was known, his relevance would end. So instead of dumping facts, he provided frameworks, ways of thinking, models that could be applied to new problems. That changed his role entirely. He wasn't just a source. He became a reference. When new routes emerged, analysts compared them to Le Roux's models. When unfamiliar overlaps appeared, they asked the same question he always asked: who benefits from this staying invisible? His silence, when it came, became meaningful. If Paul Le Roux had nothing to say about a network, it suggested something. Either it wasn't efficient enough to matter, or it hadn't matured yet. That kind of silence is rare and dangerous because it implies foresight. Behind the scenes, agencies began treating him differently, not as an ongoing defendant, but as a controlled variable, someone whose knowledge aged but didn't expire. This is where the idea of containment replaced punishment entirely, not because he deserved mercy, but because releasing or burying him too deeply would break access to understanding that might still be needed. Le Roux didn't push for public redemption. He didn't seek recognition. He accepted obscurity, which made him easier to manage and harder to forget. In the criminal world, his absence created a vacuum no one wanted to fill, because filling it meant exposure. It meant becoming visible. And visibility was exactly what Le Roux had spent his life avoiding. In government circles, his name stopped appearing in active briefings, not because he was irrelevant, but because his lessons had been absorbed, institutionalized. You don't cite the blueprint once the building stands, and that was his final advantage. He didn't just escape the game, he changed how it was played. But endings like this are never clean, because the kind of man who plans for every scenario always leaves behind one unanswered question. Did Paul Le Roux cooperate because he was cornered, or because he had already calculated that this was the safest, most efficient outcome available? That question still doesn't have an official answer. And maybe it never will, because the most dangerous players don't need to be remembered loudly. They're remembered structurally, in systems that work differently after they're gone. Paul Le Roux didn't disappear the way fugitives disappear. There was no chase into the jungle, no last message, no return under a new name in the criminal world. He vanished administratively. Once the cooperation ended, there was no celebration, No press conference explaining what he'd done, no detailed accounting of the damage, just forms, transfers, restrictions. Witness protection isn't freedom, it's surveillance with permission. And for a man who had lived by controlling systems, it was the most fitting ending imaginable. Paul Le Roux didn't escape the system, he became part of it. Somewhere inside sealed files, his knowledge still exists. Mapped logistics, failure patterns, explanations for why things once worked too well and why they never will again. Information too sensitive to release, too valuable to discard. That's the price of dealing with someone like him. You don't erase them, you absorb them. In the criminal world, his absence was louder than his presence ever was. No single figure replaced him. No new mastermind emerged. Because Paul Le Roux wasn't a kingpin, he was a keystone. Remove it, and the structure doesn't collapse dramatically. It destabilizes quietly, permanently. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because if Paul Le Roux had never been arrested, how long would his systems have lasted? And if he hadn't cooperated, how many networks would still be operating today? Governments don't like those questions, neither do criminals. The most unsettling truth isn't that Paul Le Roux outsmarted cartels. It's that he understood governments well enough to negotiate with them, not emotionally, not morally, strategically. He didn't beg for mercy. He presented a cost-benefit analysis, and it worked. Today, Paul Le Roux exists in fragments, in redacted testimony, in sealed court records, in operations that suddenly made sense years later, and in the silence left behind when global roots stopped working the way they used to. The DEA thought Paul Le Roux was just a nerd, a programmer, a facilitator, a background figure, until he moved. And by the time they understood what kind of man they were dealing with, the game had already changed. Because the most dangerous criminals don't fight the system. They study it. They don't run from power. They position themselves around it. And when they're finally caught, they don't collapse. They negotiate. This wasn't the story of a kingpin who lost. It was the story of a man who planned for every ending, including the one where he disappeared completely.